Hey everybody, I'm Shankar. I'm the Growth and Partnerships lead at Porter. We're a Y Combinator Summer 20 company and also part of the Global Startups Program and Independent Software Vendor Accelerate program at AWS. And today I'll be interviewing our Partner Development Manager, Renee Berry.
Thank you. I'm Renee Berry. I'm a Partner Development Manager with the Global Startup Program at AWS, and I am lucky to work with Shankar on a regular basis while he's been with Porter. It's been great. He's very good at his job.
Thank you.
And I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, so, we've gotten a lot of sage advice from you over the last couple of months since we've been a part of GSP, and I kind of wanted to democratize that, let other startups that are maybe thinking about a cloud GTM journey, thinking about becoming an AWS partner, get a sense of what they can expect when they have a partner development manager of their own. I think a lot of startups that are new to the whole cloud space, new to AWS partnerships, don't really know what a lot of these acronyms stand for. I definitely didn't when I started this journey. So tell me, what is a PDM?
Yeah, so a PDM is a Partner Development Manager, right? That's what it stands for. But in practice, what I'm doing is overseeing our overall partnership relationship with a particular startup. So I have a handful of startups in my portfolio, and my main goal is to help advocate for those startups within AWS. So I see myself like as a navigator and an advocate because you've heard me say this like many times, right? But like there are so many pathways that you can take within the partner network, right? Or opportunities that come up that sound really interesting, right? But like, is that best for you and how your team needs to spend their time? And so I'm like a sounding board for, those ideas and helping teams figure out how to best prioritize their time and what programs and strategies are going to make the most sense for where you are in your partnership journey and like in your growth strategy.
Yeah, no, I think we've at Porter seen the benefits of your immense knowledge in the inner workings of AWS. Is there, other than having a partner development manager, and we're fortunate enough to have a go-to-market partner development manager as well, are there any public-facing sort of places where startups can learn more about APN in general, learn more about what programs are available to them, what tools and resources are available to them?
Some of the key things to start with would be some of what you're talking about. Like we have some public information on the AWS website for the Amazon Partner Network. Some of it is public facing and some of it is in like a gated content area called Partner Central. And that's like a central hub of all sorts of resources for any partner, and like not just startup partners, but any partner can go and figure out some of the basics of what it takes to invest into the partnership motion at AWS. Startups specifically like have their own needs and content that I think there is some content in Partner Central, but less. So our team is really focused on figuring out what resources we can develop. Like we're always looking for more. So I know I'm like signing up for more work by saying that, but we are obsessed with constantly listening to our startups' needs. And so while we develop some specific playbooks, like if there are needs that our startup partners bring to us that we haven't developed yet, we are very open and willing to map those out. One of those things for startups that are interested in becoming a part of the Global Startup Program, for example, and let's say they invest in saying we're going to be a part of the partner network, we are on the software path, right? And we'd like to raise our hand for a PDM, right? Like, how do you do that, right? There are some key things that you can do to just lay the foundation for a good partnership. And these are things that Porter did, right? So like the answer to a lot of these, right? But getting listed on Marketplace is one of the key things to do. And getting into our ISV Accelerate program, right? So Porter's already done that. And then being really consistent with ACE, which I'll explain what that is in a little bit. And being, I think, one of the most underutilized functions, which you also are really good at, is really having a strong sense of your product marketing and your messaging for like how you're helping your customers. So those are some of the key components to put together if you're looking to prepare for becoming, part of the Global Startup Program. So I can break down some of what each of those things are, right? Because not everybody knows what ISVA is, but high level ISV Accelerate is our flagship co-sell program. It is designed for partners that are very well established in the market, but there are paths for startups to participate as well, as long as they have a solid relationship with their customers, right? It's not for startups that are like just testing their first product and like don't have customers yet, right? So there are a lot of steps to get in through ISVA, but once you get through that, it really sets the groundwork for collaborating with our sales field like really closely. And there are solid investments that our team make in that program, one of which is that our sales team gets a spiff, like an incentive when they're working with partners, and like to really make sure that our sellers aren't like just volunteering to work with partners, right? But we have investments in place to make sure that they are prioritizing that work with partners alongside of everything else that they're doing. So ISVA is really critical for anybody that wants to do co-sell. Then marketplace is another really key component. Some misconceptions with marketplace are that you can just get listed and then like all of a sudden like transactions are going to start, right? So if you are listed on Marketplace, on AWS Marketplace, and you're doing co-sell where you're collaborating with our sales team on the opportunity to say, how can we, like both sales teams work together just to identify how we're best supporting these customers, right? Putting those two things together are really critical. One without the other, you're not going to go as far or as fast. And then what else? Product marketing is huge and underutilized, but you hear me talk about that all the time. What is some stuff you've heard me say about that?
I think just underscoring the importance of it. I know you have a background with digital marketing, advertisements in general, so we're lucky that we have so many customers that we can write case studies about. I remember that was one of the things on the check boxes to get into ISV Accelerate is having an X amount of case studies. It's very important to be able to share the story your customers are having and are enabled with by using you as a product, as a service. And so I think the main thing, you're always emphasizing making sure to put these stories out there, making sure that we're advocating for ourselves by writing these things down and then publicizing them as widely as possible.
Totally. And so to get into ISVA, the minimum is to have 2 public-facing case studies. But I also tell startups that's the minimum. That's good. That's what you do to get started. And I always say, like, yes, those 2 are the minimum, right? But it's a starting point for how are you communicating about the outcomes that you're, enabling for your customers, right? And when you capture those stories and you include what those business outcomes are, you're then opening doors for other team members, like across our large sales network, to be able to capture that story themselves and retell that story easily, right? I hear a lot of startups that will say like, well, we sell to everyone, but then it's like, okay, well, they have like maybe 1 case study or 2, maybe 2, like the minimum, right? And I think that it's really helpful when you have those specific examples because you can build go-to-market strategies around those stories. So that can open a door to like a specific industry or like a specific team at AWS. And so once you have that door in, you can start collaborating with them based off of real, successful things that you've done for your customers, and we can work off of that.
There's a wide range of AWS partners from early stage startups to public massive enterprises. What kind of point in a startup's journey do you think they should consider going after this co-sell motion with AWS's partnership motion?
Yeah, I think part of that would be just like when to even look at investing in the overall partnership, right? I would say like super early stage startups, like it probably is too early to go down that motion because like I said, it's not a button that you can just push and then all of a sudden things are happening. Like it takes investment from both sides. And some startups don't have the resources to be able to invest in that in the right way, right? I think on the other side of that, startups are probably surprised at how early they can be to come and work with us, right? So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, where it's like you should have found some traction and product market fit. You should have live customers that are happy, and then looking to start to scale that, right?
Yeah.
As you're starting to see that success, that would be the time that you start thinking about, hey, what are some of those steps for becoming a partner, and then looking at getting listed on AWS Marketplace, and then starting to invest in some of those motions. I think the other thing that's important to think about at that phase is people, resources, right? So sometimes when startups are super early and getting started, they might not have someone who is an alliance lead to get started on the partnership stuff. And I'd say like that's okay when you're getting some of the super foundational things in place, like ISVA, but you will get through all of those steps and be better prepared to be more successful in the partnership if you have a dedicated person to drive it. So, if you're working with someone's borrowed time, then your outcomes might also be somewhat borrowed. I don't know if that works right, but I still will stick with it because I think you will get more out of it to have someone driving because there's multiple workflows that they'll need to be looking across. And so thinking about the right time for that human resources should be like another factor that you're thinking about. It doesn't need to be gating, but it should be on the horizon, I'd say within 6 to 12 months, like as you're getting started, in order for that to continue to grow in the way I think most startups would hope.
Yeah, no, I think it requires a lot of dedicated resources from both ends. And, if you're a startup thinking about partnering with AWS, you should take it seriously. So 100%. Going off that, in general, as a startup, it might seem a little daunting. It might seem like a lot of work to get a partner development manager. You have to go through all these steps. But, even case studies is one great example with the marketplace. All of these requirements are really good for you as a startup. These are things that you should have in place either way. Like for marketplace, for example, being able to transact like the Porter subscription cost over the marketplace, where it's all centralized for our customer CFO suite to be able to have all of their spend just in one place on their AWS bill. That's a fantastic benefit for us that we wouldn't have realized unless we'd gone through this journey of signing up to ISV Accelerate and getting a PDM. So I think it really speaks to how all those checkboxes, it's not busy work. It's really worth it for your organization as a whole.
That's a good point. Like, I don't think I probably even talk about that or remind people enough of it, because at first startups can feel like, oh wait, this is like a daunting list of like things I need to do to get into this program. But at the same time, you're right. Like, it's setting them up to do well, like within that partnership motion and like what that takes. And so they are just some of those foundational elements to get started.
Okay, so we covered kind of the product marketing aspect, case studies and SEO and stuff like that. How can startups leverage that existing content to broaden the horizons and get more awareness among AWS organizations and, in general?
Yeah, I think case studies are a good foundational piece. So all of the partners I work with hear me talk about case studies over and over and over again because they are so critical. But I like to think about them in terms of packages. So startups can think, oh, okay, like I'm going to do this one thing, and I'm going to layer a couple of things around that so that it's not like 10 extra workflows, right? So when you have in a case, like what's the format of a case study, right? That can be a lot of different formats, but I'll say my favorite is joint customer success blog posts. So those are blog posts hosted by our startup partners that really focus on the story of success for the end customer. And there's like some spotlight about how AWS has been a part of that story. But I try to tell partners like, it's not about AWS, it's about the startup helping the customer be successful. But it does help to show how AWS is a part of that, because that does help us with enablement for our account managers to tell those stories, and it helps us articulate what we hear a lot talked about in the partner world, which is our better together story, right? So as you develop more and more success stories with your customers and you're looking for how AWS has been a part of that, you can also start to identify certain trends which might uncover go-to-market opportunities for campaigns or collaboration with certain product teams and all of that. But yeah, so if we start with those blog posts, right, of those joint customer success stories, We could, for example, do a digital campaign to help you promote that. So Porter, for example, could do a LinkedIn awareness campaign to help raise the visibility of that blog post. And that would be something that we could provide MDF for, right? So market development funds, if we're, being careful with our acronyms. So, if you produce that content, then we can help you amplify that story to a very specific and targeted audience.
Yeah.
All right. We could also say, okay, let's do a webinar, right? So maybe that's a webinar that you would host, or a webinar that we find a third party where you're like, it would be our dream to get in front of this audience. Well, a lot of those different communities have an option for like a paid promotion or webinar, right? So if we went and evaluated which one would be the best audience to get in front of, we can do a webinar. AWS can participate in that with you, or you can lead it. Either way, then we can feature that joint customer success story as a part of that. And then that can be a mechanism, one, for awareness of that story, but two, to be a vehicle to drive leads for our startups. Because one of the things that we are really, really lasered in on is how are we helping empower growth for the startups that we're working with. So those case studies can open up all these other go-to-market pieces. So if you've got the blog post, you can layer on the digital campaign, you can layer on the webinar, you could even layer on a digital campaign for the webinar, right? Like some of these are awareness, some of these are lead gen. All of that comes from that original content around the joint customer and how they've been able to be enabled from both organizations. And then I try to say, look for frequencies, right? So if you're like, oh, okay, we can do all of those things, can you do that once a year?
Yeah.
Can you do that once a quarter? Right? How can you move up in the frequency based on like what your team feels comfortable executing? And from that, you can put together a really great go-to-market plan, like really focused on, how you are doing the best for your customers. I'll also add that not all content is like the same when it comes to impact, right? So another thing I see a lot of startups doing is releasing a blog post every week or every month on different features that they've released. And I appreciate that because I see like builders that know how to ship. At the same time, like I think that that's missing some of the components of how does that feature impact a business or a team, and like how is that going to make sure you're speaking to the pain points that those end prospects or customers like really feel on a regular basis, right? So I wouldn't say like don't do those feature updates, but I would say don't have that be the only form of like product marketing that you're doing.
Right.
Like find ways to tell those larger stories about the business impact that you're having with your customers.
No, 100%. And I think another question I had, for us, the Better Together concept works really well because we're an automated DevOps platform that runs on top of AWS. There's a lot of synergy there. For other startups that maybe don't have such a direct connecting tissue with AWS, other startup partners that have been very successful, how do they frame this Better Together story with AWS?
Yeah. A couple of things. So one, which is a very important reminder for startups, your messaging to your prospects is not going to be the same as like what was in your pitch deck when you raised money.
Of course.
You say of course, but like I see it often. Like where even like within the messaging for like, hey, this is what's going to be interesting to account managers, or like for, hey, what's your snippet about your company and like the impact you're having? Like a lot of times they're embedding like funding stats and different things like that. And it's like, okay, but like I don't know that, like that might be interesting for your overall people following your career success or the company's momentum, but that I don't think it has the same impact to someone that's hungry to have their problem solved. It's like, okay, cool, you raised money, cool, but like, are you going to solve my problem, right? And so really thinking through how you're using that messaging to be very specific to those customer needs. Or the customers that you're wishing to have might also not always match the customers that you have now, right? So thinking about like what are the most compelling ways that you are positioning what you're best at to solve those customer problems. So I think that's one thing. Company stories aren't the same as product impact.
Yeah.
So another thing would be working backwards from your customers. as far as the discovery for finding that better together story. So if you're not sure where to get started, like I know we've already talked about the importance of these customer stories, but this is actually another benefit of them. So if you're not totally sure, you can look at what those customer stories are, what has AWS been doing as a part of those customer stories with success, and then as you start to look at a few of those, where are you seeing trends?
Yeah.
Right? So you might notice like everybody in our customer base is talking about S3, right? Or they're all EKS users, right? So you'll start to uncover like some specific product stories where those synergies are naturally happening with your customers. And so saying, oh, okay, like what can we learn from those trends about then telling that story to other people that work at AWS about how we're working together. I think the other thing outside of what's working right now is to take a step back as a team and say, what are things we wish for from AWS? I tend to emphasize this a lot because I think that people probably like under ask when it comes to this, or like I'm going to do my very Amazon thing and use our leadership principles, but think big is like a big opportunity for startups and partners. And a big part of that is saying like, is there something that we've seen with a product that we wish for this feature or this integration or, this way to make it better, faster, stronger in how we're operating with our customers? It's not something if you bring to the table that you're always going to get a yes, right? But like bring it to the table, right? So there's other team members that might be able to get involved on the partnership side to drive some of that. So like a partner solutions architect would be an example of someone that is helping with the build or the technical side of the partnership. Some of these questions are really great for collaborating with them, but you can do more with them if the team comes in and has thought through some of those like wish list things or opportunities to collaborate with certain teams and know the why. Right? So rather than just be like, oh, hey, like we really want to talk to this team, like why? Like, what are you really hoping for? And how are you connecting that why to end customer impact?
No, that's great. And, I think you make a lot of sense when it comes to the mistakes you're seeing in terms of speaking to your audience that some of these startups are making. In general, what are kind of the biggest pitfalls, kind of errors that you see startups making often? And what's an easy way to counteract that?
It's hard to say this to startups, but like having patience with some of the process, right? So startups are notoriously impatient and I love working with startups because of it. But some of this is, investing in all of these different mechanisms, right? So there's skill sets, mechanisms, stories, awareness, all of these different things like help bring the partnership together. And it is not something where you push a button and magically everything happens within a week.
Yeah.
Right? So when I say patience, I don't mean like, oh, you have to wait like 10 years before you see any impact, but it's also like not going to be a week. And sometimes there's this feeling like, oh, well, we got into ISVA, like, why aren't we getting referrals right away? Right? And what I say there is that this is like a huge, huge part of this is building relationships with our team.
Yeah.
Right? So there are three main motions that we go through within partnerships with AWS: build, market, and sell. Right? And on any of those motions, building relationships, earning trust with our team, and giving the teams the opportunity to build trust together is really, really critical for doing kind of next level innovative work. And so don't underestimate how valuable taking the time to invest in those relationships is.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely on the money with this.
Yeah, I think the most impatient area I see people with that is on the co-sell side. So like ACE is one of our systems. It's like our joint sales force essentially for partnerships, right? And I think some startups take it very seriously and are really consistent with their data and putting information into ACE so that everybody's on the same page about, what opportunities we're working on together and where to focus next, how to close stuff out that's not relevant anymore. Others are mediocre with it, right? The ones that are highly invested in being consistent with putting things in there and keeping it up to date get a much higher return on what they're getting from co-sell because they're consistently getting opportunities to meet and develop relationships with our field, compared to those that are putting in like one opportunity per month to collaborate on. Like you just aren't going to get the same relationship development, with that volume.
Yeah, I think, one thing we like to say, this phrase, trust is earned, not given.
Yeah.
And it's very true. And, yes, of course, as a startup, you're moving fast. We know very well. We look at KPIs in terms of weeks and months, not years, right? Not quarters. But you have to put in a lot of effort to see those outsized results at the end. And it's really worth putting in that effort and taking the time to do things properly. With ACE, I spent a ton of time on ACE, and for good reason. It works out really well.
It has. I mean, you talked about a go-to-market PDM, right, as part of the team. So this is not a part of the team that everybody gets. But when we see teams that are being consistent with these systems, then it kind of qualifies the startups that are standing out with data that are ready for the next level of investment, right? And so that gave me, something to go advocate for Porter, because I was like, look at how much they're doing. They're doing amazing. This is something I talk about often, and this is a perfect example of it, where we have a lot of partners, right, at AWS. It's amazing to see how many partners there are. A lot of the partners want the same things. Right? And so some of those things are awareness, right? It's the relationships, it's referrals, right? Or all these different opportunities for building together. But if you're not investing in some of the basics, it's hard to get those outcomes. And how can you stand out when there's a lot, right? Demonstrating your success.
Yeah.
Right? And so some of these foundational elements, people are like, oh yeah, well, that's the basics. Of course we're doing that. But if you're putting minimal effort into that actually can make a big difference. If you're putting the bare minimum, the minimum, right? The bare minimum versus hey, we're going to invest in this and we're going to be consistent with it. You're going to see a much higher return because you're standing out by demonstrating that success, as opposed to being a partner that's hey, look how great I am, talk.
Right.
No, we're seeing it through real stuff that you're putting forward. So Shankar, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here and ask you a question too.
Sure.
What has been something that you've been surprised with in going through all of these motions and in partnerships with AWS as a startup?
I think, and I covered this a little bit earlier, but the most surprising thing is that as a startup, right, you're spread pretty thin most of the time. You're trying to cover a lot of surface area, and it's always a little difficult to balance what matters most. AWS partnership, it's something that we really wanted to invest in, just because it makes a lot of sense for us from a go-to-market perspective. But going through the motions of getting on ISVA, having these dedicated AWS resources has really informed a lot of our general go-to-market strategy, which I did not expect, right? It's not just this one channel that you're dedicating resources to for this one outcome. It all kind of comes together with your overall go-to-market motion. And a lot of the lessons you learn working with AWS salespeople and how they're pitching your company to the clients, right, in this co-sell motion. And then, particularly you teaching us so much about how content works, how best to position ourselves with our content, how to spread that around. It's been really informative for Porter as a whole. So I think that's probably the most surprising thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming out to the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me and letting me kind of take the role of interviewer here for a little bit.
It was fun. Thanks.